I'm really thrilled and honored to be here at the SBSD Forum. So what I'd like to speak about are really the key lessons from my recent book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. So the current moment that we're facing is one of an extreme wake-up call globally. We found ourselves completely unprepared to deal with a health pandemic. We did not manage globally to provide personal protection equipment to our frontline workers. We did not manage to reduce the digital divide so that children at home could continue to access their human right to education. And really crucially, we are not managing to vaccinate the entire world. In fact, we have what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, calls vaccine apartheid, where most of the vaccines are actually being hoarded by a very small group of countries. And of course, we also know that this health pandemic has been on the back of another terrible crisis, which COP26 has been debating the last couple of weeks, which is the climate crisis. And here too, we're simply not moving at pace. We had a 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg, tell us 2 years ago, if your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I stay? Should I go? No, you get out quickly. And we're not moving at pace. And the IPCC report told us this summer that if we don't start moving much more at pace, urgently, getting out of a burning home, the climate change we are facing right now will become irreversible. And we also know that global companies have, really in some ways been in trouble, and they're talking about how to change, but we're not really seeing the walk yet. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the walk towards a different model of corporate governance. We have a lot of extraction happening globally, where something like $4 trillion has been used just to buy back one's own shares amongst the global 500 corporations globally. And this is why there's a lot of talk about bringing purpose and stakeholder value to the center of corporate governance instead of just maximizing shareholder value. But unfortunately, this isn't really changing. In fact, one of the reasons that we're not vaccinating the globe properly is that a lot of even large pharmaceutical companies continue to prioritize short-term profits and use intellectual property rights, so patents, as a way to extract rents. And this is not the moment, of course, to be doing this, given that what we really need with COVID-19 is collective intelligence and sharing of knowledge. We also have, and this is what I've been talking about for years, a huge problem within our government institutions. In order to transform our growth model to be more inclusive and to be more sustainable, we can't just keep patching up the system with bandages. So either we have kind of a regressive attitude towards governments, the kind of Reaganite attitude, get out of the way. But the real problem is that at best, on the other side, we talk about the role of government as fixing market failures, putting patches on the system, investing in the gaps that are left by the private sector, research and development, or putting patches on climate change, maybe with a carbon tax. And these, of course, are needed, these patches, but they can't be done through patches. They need to be done through a market shaping, a market creating framework, not a market fixing one. Because if you're always fixing a system, you will, of course, always be too little, too late. So what I talk about in my book, Mission Economy, is we can do better. We can do much better. And we need to do better, not through philanthropy and charity. We need to do better by how we actually do capitalism, how we do business, how we do public-private partnerships, how we create an ecosystem between all the different actors in the system that really allow to create value and direct the economy in a way that achieves really important goals. And you'll remember that 51 years ago, John F. Kennedy made an incredible speech about the moon landing, where, first of all, he was very clear where we were going. He wanted to get to the moon and back, not stay up there, within a short time period. He said within a generation. So it was a very clear goal that was set in order to foster lots of private and public innovation and investment. But really importantly, he talked about this as being difficult, that we had to embrace the difficulty, the uncertainty. He said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy, and that we might even mess up along the way. It required huge amounts of experimentation. In fact, they didn't really know where they were going initially. They had different ways of getting to the moon. They finally landed on the lunar orbit rendezvous, but the willingness to experiment, to take risks, to learn from trial and error. And in fact, one of the biggest errors was the Apollo 1 tragedy, where 3 astronauts died. And one of the 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, before dying, had yelled, "How are we going to get to the moon when we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" And what he was referring to was the fact he couldn't hear what was being said in Mission Control Room. So what NASA did was learn from that problem. It didn't just stick with the plan. They changed their organizational structure to be much more horizontal, flexible, agile, so that the institution could actually work between the different departments, so not within each silo. And this model here you see is what George Mueller from Bell Labs came up with. And this is so important because we often complain about government bureaucracy, but there's no reason why bureaucracy should be something bad. It could be a creative bureaucracy. So if we're interested in common purpose and stakeholder value, what is the organizational form that we actually require in order to be as flexible, agile, communicating horizontally in order to foster those public-private partnerships that are needed? And in fact, there was huge amounts of partnerships between the state and the private sector, many different companies, not just in aerospace, also in sectors like nutrition, electronics, materials. The whole software industry, in some ways, was an outcome of the moon landing. Lots of spillovers like athletic shoes, foil blankets, camera phones, and so on. But really, what was also so interesting is that the partnership was designed precisely in order to foster this kind of bottom-up experimentation. And the procurement contracts, which really are the interface of public and private, were designed to also be fair. They had a no excess profits clause. In other words, if we're going to invest together, how do we not turn this into a gambling casino where a lot of money can get extracted out, socializing risks, privatizing rewards, but actually earn the right amount given what each partner is doing? They also changed the procurement to be fixed price, not cost plus, almost like a prize scheme, but with constant incentives for innovation and quality improvement. And it was this precisely that allowed all these really dynamic spillovers to occur and to create so many economic opportunities on Earth through this space race. And also what was interesting was that the same guy, Ernest Brackett, who created this new procurement system, argued that if NASA stopped investing in its own brain and just outsourced all the capacity, they wouldn't even know how to work with the private sector. So he said that we will get captured by brochuremanship, which today would be modern PowerPoints of consulting companies, convincing governments to work with them. He said, if we outsource capacity, we won't know who to work with, how to work with them, and we won't actually be able to partner in a dynamic way. So really what the book talks about is how can we apply this ambitious, dynamic approach to organizational structure, to public-private partnerships that have real incentives for innovation and quality improvement, but all focused towards a goal, a common goal. And really the goals today have to be the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which every country, Korea, the United States, Italy, where I'm from, Brazil, every country has signed up to them. But we're not moving at pace on any of them. These are 17 broad goals, which I call challenges, which must each be turned into different types of moonshots, different types of missions. And to do this, I've been advocating with different governments that they actually implement a mission-oriented approach. This is an example of how I made the case to the European Commission to begin with their challenge approach of inclusive and sustainable growth, but turn that into a targeted, ambitious mission that can actually be answered, yes or no, did we get there? And to foster as much intersectoral collaboration as possible. This is required so that we take missions outside of departmental silos. And then to really structure the tools on the ground, grants, loans, procurement, to foster as much bottom-up experimentation. So here you see an example of two missions, one around carbon neutral cities and another one around getting 90% of the plastic out of the ocean. And for each one of those, so many different sectors are required, whether it's real estate, construction materials, transport, software, and so on. But what missions have to do is they must inspire. They must be bold and inspirational. They must have a clear direction. They must be ambitious while realistic. They must foster that cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary interaction. I repeat interdisciplinary because as an academic, it's not just about STEM subjects. We also need poets and the humanities to help us think about how we want to live in the future. And they especially need to be designed to drive multiple bottom-up solutions. The one-way, linear, top-down system kills innovation. We know that. And it's not about the state doing everything, but it's the state putting a direction on change and then fostering that bottom-up solutions. But this really means tilting the playing field, making sure that we have all the different policies and activities aligned in that direction. And the European Commission has, on the back of my work, chosen 5 EU mission areas. We have the Horizon program now, which is 100 billion euros, which has a chunk of it dedicated to these missions. But of course, the real goal is to foster as much different investments amongst the private sector and public sector as possible. So providing that mission-oriented leadership can then crowd in other forms of finance. So one of the things I've also been doing is convincing or helping governments transform their industrial strategies away from being a list of sectors to protect, instead of choosing sectors, which will always be a random list of sectors, choosing the problems that are being faced. So the UK government, with my work, decided on these 4 bold problems, challenges: clean growth, future of mobility, aging society, and the data economy. And then transforming each one of those challenges into missions like the future of mobility one, which advocated for having a system of transport which was both congestion-free, but also 100% accessible by all people, including those with disabilities. So some of those bottom-up projects, of course, had to address the world of disabilities. This also means that we need to transform our financial institutions like public wealth funds or public banks away from just giving subsidies, grants, and loans for companies to stay in place, but really be transformational. So I helped set up a new public bank in Scotland, which is a mission-oriented public bank, providing that patient long-term finance to those companies that are willing, I repeat, willing, because we must pick the willing, not pick the winners, willing to move with Scotland around its ambitious agendas, for example, digitalizing the National Health Service. And it's also quite interesting to ask, how can we get citizens, people involved in these missions so that they're actually chosen by community participation? So some work that I'm doing in Camden, a part of London where I live, I helped set up a new Camden Renewal Commission, where the missions are very local and they're based on community interaction, so that the clean growth mission, for example, is nested within the housing estates, so social housing. And the key thing is to get resident associations into the process of even discussing how do we want to live together. So clean growth is not just about retrofitting housing and buildings, but also about a debate between the people living in those homes, how to live in a more sustainable way so we can actually reach net zero ambitions. In Sweden, I have been inspired by the fact that the government has a very high-level mission about a carbon-free welfare state, but then they land it on very concrete areas like school meals. So every school has to produce or procure, coming back to the procurement point, meals that are tasty, healthy, and sustainable, which means that the goal is very clear because the meals have to be produced in a particular way, but the how remains open, and the children in the schools and the students in the school become part of it. They help to design the meals, but they also learn about sustainability of food production throughout their entire curriculum. And I think all these lessons that I'm talking about are really key if we want to walk the talk of stakeholder value. As I mentioned, in places like the World Economic Forum, we talk about purpose, we talk about stakeholder value, but if we can't do it with the vaccine, well, when are we going to do it? But we must do it with our digital platforms, with innovation, and of course with the sustainable growth path of clean technology. It's not enough to just invest in an area if we don't govern the process towards the common good. And this is why people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman in the United States, but many others, including myself, have been advocating, if we care about health for all, what does that actually mean for how we price drugs, for how we construct public-private partnerships, for how we stop allowing patents to lead to the kind of rent extraction I talked about before. Patents are fine, but they must be narrow, they must be weak, so easy to license, and they must be downstream, not upstream. If we have patents that are too upstream in the production process, that means that we are actually privatizing the research itself, which then hurts that kind of knowledge sharing that we require, and especially for developing countries, the needed imitation in that first stage to even learn how to produce and innovate in a particular area. And I think also one of the interesting lessons from COVID-19 is that we're putting huge amounts of money into the system last minute because of the health pandemic. Well, we should be careful. Next time, let's make sure that we are actually investing in the needed resources like health systems in a more continuous, normal way, not just on the back of a pandemic where, again, it's too little too late. But also, there's an opportunity right now to really build back better, or build forwards better, an expression I prefer, by putting in conditionalities that are linked to the public funds that are helping certain types of companies in the aerospace industry and the tourism industry and all sorts of sectors that are really feeling the weight of a pandemic where we've been in lockdown for a long part of the last 2 years. And you see here the face of the French finance minister, because he actually put some strong conditions attached to the bailouts that were received by Renault, the car manufacturer, Air France. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in the next 5 years in order to access that bailout. Similarly in Scotland, but also in Austria and Denmark, they put conditions that those countries that have become accustomed to using tax havens will not be able to access the recovery funds. And it shouldn't be seen as a stick. It should really be seen as a carrot. How do we make sure that instead of just flooding the system with liquidity, as we did after the financial crisis, or just giving out subsidies and guarantees, we actually work to construct the kind of public-private partnerships that got us to the moon, that argue no excess profits, and how to use prize schemes to move towards a direction of change, tilting the playing field, picking the willing, shaping markets, not just fixing them. So I'm now done with my presentation, and really what I hope is that this idea of missions and moonshots allows us to really do capitalism differently, because the economy and markets are outcomes. There's no economic pressure being faced by anyone. The economy is an outcome of decisions that we make within private institutions, within public institutions, and especially how they relate one to another. So I really advocate for walking the talk of stakeholder value, but also within governments to transform the current remit, which is simply to fix markets. I believe we need to shape and co-create the markets of the future in order to tackle the challenges that we have. And again, we've all signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the challenges. This is the moment to turn them into moonshots. Thank you so much.